The fact that you and I are now sitting, I in New York, you in Canada, having this interweb conversation in a podcast is probably 0.0001% likelihood.
My first year as an executive was unbelievably scary, and I felt like I didn't belong there, and everyone had master's degrees, some people had two, and my mom was on welfare, and we're fine, and everything was okay, and I'm still privileged, but like, I don't think I belonged in that room, and it took me a year and a half to feel like I belonged.
You gotta sit at the table like you own it because you're there to drive value. Health is one of those things. If I'm not healthy for a week, I can still perform. If I'm not healthy for 2 weeks, I can still perform. And then at some point, long-term lack of health, performance tanks. If you couple performance and health together and driving their own either top-line growth, value proposition, exit potential, some kind of business imperative, the likelihood of that success is much greater.
We're going to talk a bunch about leadership, culture, not just company culture, but culture changes from China to North America and maybe India to North America, and how do you break in? Can you give us a bit of your background from your own words about like why you're passionate about this and why you're a good person to speak to it, because I think you really are.
First of all, thank you, Matt, so much for having me on. I love having these conversations because I think they're candid, they're authentic, and I think that it actually is a great way for us to have a conversation and a dialogue about things that are frankly affecting all of us and we're all constantly processing. Whenever I get asked this question, I always like to start in the beginning because I think that it informs all of us about context because context matters. And for me personally, my context started in Nanchang, China in the first year of the one-child policy. And I was obviously born a girl in a very different China than it is today in many ways. My parents had been sent for re-education to southern China on a labor camp because of their educational background and their parents being merchants and business people. And so I share that only in a little bit of a context because, as I was saying to you earlier, Matt, the fact that you and I are now sitting, I in New York, you in Canada, having this interweb conversation, in a podcast is probably 0.0001% likelihood. Mm-hmm. And so I think for those who have been given much, in many ways, much can be and frankly should be expected, because I think we are all incredibly fortunate in whatever form of blessings you conceive it to be. And so for me, I think that, when I arrived with my parents in the US, nobody gave us a handbook. No one gave us a guidebook in terms of how to assimilate. We knew that we had to study. We knew that we had to speak English well, but that was it. And I think if we can all help each other and pay it forward a little bit in terms of giving the next generation a bit more in terms of what does executive presence really mean? How does an outsider become an insider? What does it take to move forward? How do you actually think about leadership, not just in the tactical skills and the strategic thinking and the problem solving, but how do you show up as a leader? I think these are the conversations that I hope we have more and more as we think about really accelerating the growth of the next, 100 million executive leaders that might not look the same as the current leadership.
Now I'm fired up because my first year as an executive was unbelievably scary, and I felt like I didn't belong there, and everyone had master's degrees, some people had two, and my mom was on welfare, and we're fine, and everything was okay, and I'm still privileged, but like, I don't think I belonged in that room, and it took me a year and a half to feel like I belonged. So I am fired up. So why don't we start on the more personal side? Like, how do you move from an outsider to an insider? Because you were, I guess, way outside from China, from a labor camp, and then now you led David Yurman, right? If I don't know, I'll bleep the name out if I can't, if you don't want me to say it later. But
it's totally fine. Yeah, you can say the name.
Okay, right. So you led David Yurman through a massive expansion and turnaround. And so, tell me more. How did you?
It's funny because I think I'm such an advocate for education amongst those that don't necessarily seem like the first candidates for higher education, because I think that is the great equalizer. And it has been for many, many thousands of years. And so for me personally, I think, my parents really believed in education. They believed in education of girls. And so I think for me, that was my ticket in. And obviously, I like to joke that I've graduated with every recent recession. And so for any listeners out there that might be a little bit nervous, might be questioning what it means to be graduating amongst this huge AI boom and what does that
Hmm.
mean in a soft economy, what I
Hmm.
would say is follow your passion. I think that has to be the number one lesson that I personally have lived by and I think has served me well. Passion doesn't mean just blindly chasing what it is that you like to do, but maybe, haven't really tested your own capabilities in. I'll share a framework that I often apply, which is to say, what are your passions? What are you good at? And what does society recognize and will reward you for? Because I think what you're good at and what you enjoy doing is probably a hobby if society doesn't reward you or recognize
Sure.
you as being distinctly different.
Hmm.
To me, I think I always chase my passion in terms of what I authentically believed I could disproportionately contribute to. And I think for any Asian immigrant who comes, your parents want you to be a doctor or work in investment banking or, be an attorney, a
Uh-huh.
dentist, all of these classic roles. And I think these are amazing roles. They weren't the right roles for me because I think I was always probably my mouth got me into trouble much too often. I was way too opinionated about what I thought about. I questioned and was curious about everything,
Interesting.
which really made, I think, management consulting terrific for me. And it was a great platform for me to build a lot of capabilities and skills. And so to answer your question, I think that was a great launching pad. And I think had I stayed in just classic consulting, I would have probably gotten bored. But the
Mm.
firm that I was at McKinsey for about 15 years. I was able
15
to
years.
actually
That's a long
grow
time to make
and
it to
launch
McKinsey.
businesses for a part of McKinsey called McKinsey Ventures. And I think I just
Okay.
got this bug where it was, how do I build a business? How do I scale it? What products resonate? What products
Sure.
don't? How do you get other advocates to come on board? How do you negotiate a board who doesn't know anything about your topic to sign on and actually join you in a cause that's greater than, either that board member or myself?
Hmm.
And I think that was ultimately what led me into private equity because I think that notion of growing businesses and helping them accelerate and scale was just a natural red thread that has really carried me. My
Can I?
transition to David Yurman, had you called me 6 years or 7 years ago and said, gosh, Emily, you're going to be helping lead a turnaround and grow David Yurman, I think I would have probably told you, I think you got the wrong girl, not because of anything else, but because I was probably an unexpected, person to lead a luxury turnaround. And the reason I think that it was in many ways a perfect place for me to be is because I think that it was a brand that was so well respected, but had gotten a little bit tired and
Yeah.
it had lost a little
Yep.
bit of its, way. But the bones and the intrinsics of the business were so terrific. And we can talk a little bit more about it in a second. But
That'd
I
be great.
think
Yeah.
that was ultimately staying true to what I loved and that curiosity of figuring out how do we solve this? Are the intrinsics there of the business? And how do I think about really using all of the things that I've learned along the way to really bring something even bigger to bear?
Got it. So can I ask, you mentioned like your education and passion, finding what you're good at and what society will reward you for. For you, how did you make your way to management consulting and how did you know that that was the thing that you wanted to do and that you'd get rewarded for?
Great question, Matt. I think, I will tell a story and it'll always sound perfect in retrospect. But I think at the time, I think it was a little bit of trial and error, right? I think for me personally, I knew that I wanted to work on a bunch of different things and I was
Okay.
curious about a bunch of different things. But also, I think growing up the way that I did, I was always curious about what does it feel like to work with people who are equally passionate and equally fired up about the things that I was curious about. I always think, if you want an ordinary life, do ordinary things. If you want to live an extraordinary life, you've got to kind of push yourself beyond the limits that you've traditionally known. And I see it in you because I know that you've done tremendous entrepreneurial things. There's no classic book. There's no chapter 1, 2, and
No.
3. And so I think there's a little bit of just being curious about,
Yeah.
well, if I choose door 1, what does that lead me down? And if I go next time, go down door 2, what does that look like? And I think
Mm.
that infectious nature of being curious was ultimately what led me to McKinsey.
Did you try some things that you didn't like along that path? Yeah.
Totally. I think, I started my career actually in new product launches at this company that focused on toward all types of fast moving consumer good CPG launches. And so I worked on things like the Swiffer launch. And I know Swiffer sounds like such
Awesome.
a everyday brand, but many, many moons ago, it was a complete
Oh
innovation.
yeah,
And I was part of
totally. There
that.
was no Swiffers at
There
some
was
point
no
in our
Swiffer.
existence.
Exactly. What was the world like? Well, I took out a chisel and axe and I know. Yeah. but I was part of the team that launched Swiffer. I was part of the team that launched DiGiorno. I know that's crazy.
DiGiorno, get
Self-rising
out of here.
crust. I know,
That's so
right?
fun.
It's so fun. But I think I was always curious about what gets consumers fired up. What would be valuable to a consumer? Where are there
Hmm.
gaps in the market? And I really loved it, but it was incredibly analytical. And I was always curious about, well, what happens? Are numbers and modeling it, or are there other things? And so I ran the other way. I ran all the way to advertising and I loved it. It was so cool. How do you think about moving the emotional awareness of a
Hmm.
consumer such that they're going to really follow you on this emotional journey? And at
Hmm.
some point, to your point about experimentation, I realized in the middle of a discussion about how orange an orange campaign could be that I thought, everyone else is super passionate about this shading of orange, and
Sure.
I am just not on that same boat. And there wasn't a right or wrong. It was just not for me. And I think figuring out what you're good at, that kind of
Yeah.
framework of what am I good at? What am I passionate about?
Yeah.
That was not where I said the world was rewarding me for it, but it wasn't filling my bucket.
Hmm.
And so I think, there were a lot of test and learns. And then I went to a startup at the time. I was very early employee at a company called ComScore Networks. Now it's a publicly traded company,
Yeah.
one of the largest online data providers on the market. And it was started by a man named Jan Fulgoni and Majid Abrams. They were the original founders of IRI, which at the time was one of the largest competitors to Nielsen for Nielsen in-store data. And
Sure.
I just remember, being 26 and sitting with Jan and really understanding his entrepreneurial drive, this multi-time serial entrepreneur, and what does it take to really realize a vision? How do you bring this collective group of people together while you're continuing to
Hmm.
iterate on what that product that you're offering the market is? I mean, this is early 2000s when you're still trying to figure
Yeah.
out, what do you mean cyber reputational risk? I mean, now we
Yeah.
take it for
Yeah.
granted, but at
Yeah.
that
Of
time,
course.
it's like, what? We're all going to have digital fingerprints? What does that mean? So it was super exciting. So lots of experimentation, Matt.
Okay. And so then eventually you find your way to McKinsey and you love it. And I'm assuming, I've never worked in McKinsey and I haven't worked at any of the big four accounting firms, but there's probably some element of cutthroatness to those places. And so I mean, you stayed for 15 years, which is a very long time in a place like that. So how did you hack it for 15 years? How did you become on the inside there? And like, what did you do to make your mark, so to speak?
I'm not sure that there was only one thing that I can put my finger on, but I can maybe give you a list of maybe two or three things.
Sure.
I think the baseline for staying at any place that has a high performing culture is I
Hmm.
think you have to perform. I think those are table stakes. And I think you really need to understand what the language of performance is within a particular context. And so for me, I think a firm like McKinsey is very clear about this. It's around problem solving. It's around really being able to work collaboratively. They're very, very clear about it. But I think for anyone who's starting a career in any context, whether it's cutthroat or not, you really need to understand what the language of performance looks like, because that is the baseline. I think anything else is sort of the cherry on top. But
Okay.
without the foundation, I think you're going to not have as much fun as you could. I think the
Yeah.
second thing is, I think, you need to authentically love it and authentically want to be a part of that culture. And I'll share a story with you, Matt, because I think this one I always take with me because I think that cultural fit is so important.
Hmm.
The first effort that the first study I ever did was a study in Los Angeles for the largest social media company at the time. And it was hilarious because every Monday morning, the whole team would get on a plane and we would fly. And this is day one, week one, you know, 28-year-old Emily shows up for work. And I was such an outsider. I didn't know where to buy women's suits, right? So I thought,
Oh
okay,
my
day
gosh. Yeah.
one, I'm going to go buy a suit. And this is, again, many moons ago. So I went to Brooks Brothers and I said, I will pick that one, but in the women's section. So I
Uh-huh.
have this like little man suit that
Uh-huh.
I showed up in. And because we were serving a social media company in Los Angeles, the entire rest of the team showed up at the airport in a flip-flops, shorts, and a
You're kidding.
t-shirt. And literally we looked like I was like a tax auditor. And
Sure.
the
Yeah.
rest of the
Oh,
team
yeah.
was clearly in tech.
Hmm.
And I think this is something that I just never even understood because I think no one hands you that book to say, hey,
No,
this
they
is what
don't.
a cultural fit looks like for you to actually blend in and truly assimilate into this corporate culture. And not just this corporate culture of McKinsey, but this corporate culture of this social media company in LA on the West Coast. And I think that to me is something that even if I had performed and whizzed it out, had I continued to not look
Yeah.
up and blend in, I would not have been set up for success.
That makes so much sense. What my interview with private equity back in 2016, 2017, I was like, do I wear fucking black or brown shoes? I want to be taken seriously. I don't know what shoes I'm supposed to wear. Do I wear a tie? I don't even know. So I had a friend who worked at Leith Wheeler it's a multi-billion dollar investment firm. I said, dude, I don't know what I'm supposed to wear. Can I wear brown shoes? Should I
Yeah.
go buy black shoes like on the way there? He's like, look, it's probably fine. They're a smaller outfit. They'll take you seriously. But I had no idea. Oh my gosh.
It's so true, right? And I think we take it for granted because, and I
Mm.
don't know about you, Matt, but as I think about my kids now, right? Like you called a friend. You didn't call your parents. You didn't
No, they
call
wouldn't know.
anyone in your family. And similarly, I didn't know who to call even. So
Mm.
when I spoke to my family, they were like, well, like, Uncle so and so has a suit from Brooks Brothers. You should go to Brooks Brothers. In
Oh,
in no world would I tell my daughters now to go buy a suit at
right.
Brooks Brothers to show
Yeah.
up for work. And of course, the context is different. But this is why I think, it's performance plus really understanding the cultural fit of where you're actually landing.
And then I imagine you eventually felt like you belonged there.
I had a great time. I mean, I feel like I lived multiple different careers. Yes, is the short answer. I loved my time there. I think careers are never linear. I think there are always ups and downs. And I think what doesn't challenge you, doesn't push you to your next S curve of growth, you're probably at a place where you're plateauing. And so I think if you're not feeling a little bit uncomfortable about either the skills that you currently have, the people that you're currently working with, or the context that you're actually learning in, you're probably not challenging yourself in the fullest context.
Okay. And and so now you've led firms like David Yurman, firms like Sneex. Do you feel like you belong at the top of these companies?
That's such a funny question, Matt, because I think, on all the good days, yes. But on all
Yeah.
the days when the numbers are soft and the tariffs go up and, crazy things are happening in the geopolitical world, all of us, I'm sure, kind of sit there and say, oh my gosh, what is
100%.
happening? What am I doing? What should I do? And so I think, I have loved being at the top of organizations where I feel like I have an ability to really drive disproportional impact.
Mhm.
But I would be lying if I told you I felt like I belonged at the top every single day.
That's a really cool way to put it. Yeah, I feel the same way. Sometimes I think, yeah, I'm like, yes, I nailed it. I should be here. And other days, I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know what to do next. Yeah, that's a good point. So now, well, wait, would you add anything about becoming from moving from an outsider to an insider before you move on?
I will add one thing.
Sure.
I think that I love being on the cusp of always feeling a little bit like an outsider
Mm.
who needs to feel like I'm on my journey to becoming an insider. I think the moment that you always feel like an insider, you lose the external perspective of seeing the full context and thinking about what you might want to change. However, I'll be a bit provocative because I'm oftentimes, I shouldn't say always, oftentimes the only petite, young Asian
Uh-huh.
female in a
Yeah,
boardroom,
100%.
in an exco, in a panel. And so inevitably, I will always feel a little bit like an outsider. But what I always coach my team and a lot of my mentees is that, but if you think about yourself always as an outsider, you will be othered. And so take that giant chip off of your shoulder and you gotta sit at the table like you own it, because you're there to drive value. And so I think there's this delicate balance of don't get too comfortable thinking that you're an insider all the time, but don't always think that you're the outsider, because you might not take the risks and the shots that you should and you deserve.
That's great advice. So I wanted to dig in on growth and change management and how like transformation. So at David Yurman, you led cultural transformation, you drove 25% growth, built a high performance culture at Sneex. So what I want to know is how do I know when my culture is actually holding back growth versus needing just optimization?
Oh, such a good question. Such a good question. I mean, to me, I think culture can either really accelerate or frankly be a silent cap, right?
Mm,
And it's hard to tell because I think inevitably you have to kind of watch for a few of the canaries in the mine, so to speak. I mean, it's funny that I'm using this analogy because we're
hmm.
watching it in a very different context in the US when it comes
Right.
to free speech.
Yeah.
Um, but there are some natural sort of canaries in the mine that you will see and you will feel if you do not have a true healthy culture. Um, the way I think about culture is that, and I love and I hate the word culture because I got to be straight with you. Like, I fucking hate the word because, like, what is it? Like, can I see it? Can I touch it? And how do I measure it?
Hmm.
I like to think about it in terms of performance and health, right? And almost like a medical report, right? If am I able to run a mile? If so, like, what is my blood pressure? Like, what are the metrics by which
Cool.
I'm actually assessing my own physical health? The same way that I would be thinking about my organizational health.
That's really helpful.
I think about it in terms of health because you and I both know, just if we're thinking about ourselves as athletes, I can kind of perform if I'm not sleeping well for a week, maybe
Hmm.
2 weeks.
Hmm.
But at some point I hit a cliff. So this is what I mean, right? Like, health is one of those things. If I'm not healthy for a week, I can still perform. If I'm not healthy for 2 weeks, I can still perform. And then at some point, long-term lack of health, performance tanks.
Hmm.
And so as an organization, the reason that we have all this talk about fluff is because a lot of times organizations will say, well, we're still performing. Well, are
Hmm.
you? Are you? And so if I pull on this red thread of health, I think about it in sort of three different ways, which is, do people and leadership all understand the direction of travel that we're going in? Do people understand the direction
Hmm.
of travel? And I know that might sound like strategic alignment to some people,
Sure.
but what is underneath that is a healthy understanding of alignment. That's number one. I think the second thing that I typically think about health is, do we actually have the capabilities and the skills and the tools and the context and the vernacular and the language to actually execute what it is that we're trying to do? And again, that might sound like process, but what inevitably holds us back a lot of times when you think about whether or not a healthy organization might be able to deliver that, whether or not the context actually supports it. You and I both know there have been plenty of organizations that have done a bunch of efficiency optimization around
Yep.
processes.
Yep.
And then the moment that the CEO turns around, or the moment that the
Yeah.
COO turns
Yeah.
around, people go back doing exactly what they were doing before. That is
100%.
the difference between compliance and true alignment, right? And
Yep.
so in compliance is you're standing in front of me, you tell me you want me to do it this way. I nod, you nod, we shake hands, you turn around, and then I just go back to doing whatever I was doing before.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. Yes. And I hate when that happens.
And so I think when we think about health transformations, which is what I really believe in, is
Hmm.
how do you actually sustain performance in a way that the organization is in alignment, is able to execute, and feels recognized and rewarded for the things that they contribute. And if you're able to do that in a sustained way, it becomes a virtuous cycle where health and performance become a flywheel.
Cool.
Oftentimes, when organizations say that they are healthy or they have cultural achievement, what you begin to realize is they're solving for things that are, and I hate the word, but virtue signaling,
Yep.
right? They're filling KPIs
Hmm.
rather than actual intrinsic health indicators.
So you said indicators, and actually, I wanted to ask that question, which is, um, first you have to kind of, I imagine you can assess your performance relatively objectively, but your health maybe not so. How do you figure out, how do you figure out if an organization is healthy? Because you have to, I guess, know what it is and then figure out how to fix it, which would be my next question. But hey, yeah, what do you do? What are the tools that you use or methods maybe to figure out if a culture is healthy or not, or a company is healthy?
I mean, I think some of them are, I think this is the perennial question, and I think there are a lot of different tools, a lot of different ways to assess. I do think that you have to measure, and you actually, and of course, there are a lot of different ways that are traditional surveys, data collection, et cetera. I also think in this new age of AI and
Hmm.
frankly, real behavioral tracking, you're able to actually collect a lot of data from the way that your employees are frankly just behaving, right? So for example, one of the things that this is many years ago during COVID when we knew a lot of organizations had employees that were completely burnt out, you didn't have to survey them. You could actually just see the number of people logged on between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. and that were working to understand,
Oh.
right, whether or not an organization was being healthy. I mean, there is so much data in there. And I think the number one thing that you have to do before you collect any kind of data is to say, what are you really trying to solve for from a
Hmm.
health perspective? Is it retention? Is it employee satisfaction? Is it employee productivity? And to all of this, Matt, and this is, I think this is where you're going to realize, I'm a business person and not just a quote culture person, is my analogy to you is an athlete can be very satisfied and very happy on a Friday night, watching a movie, eating a bag of popcorn. They're not going to perform.
Hmm.
And so for any culture survey that measures employee satisfaction and happiness,
Hmm.
to me, those are not great indicators
Hmm.
necessarily of performance,
Interesting.
right? But
Yeah.
performance, if you want, to me, organizations need to solve for health to drive performance. And so to me, the indicators of health are, do I believe in the mission of the company? Am I aligned to the vision of the company? Do I, Emily or Matt, have the ability to do my job in an efficient and productive way? Do I believe that I'll be rewarded in a productive and effective way that recognizes my contribution? I think these things speak to the overall health of how aligned this employee is to the overall value creation thesis that we're trying to drive towards.
Incredible. I'm glad I'm recording this because I can't take notes fast enough. So, so
But do you
you
feel nuance, Matt, in terms of like
well,
how culture measures, like oftentimes, and I'm not trying to poo-poo, like, it's like, are you happy? Are you satisfied? It's like,
yeah,
well, I am very happy. I don't feel like working still. I'm not going to do my job, right? There's a difference between the two.
yes. So I've seen there's like employee NPS scores where it is like, do you like coming to work and things like that. And then I actually now I think about it, I've seen one that says, you know, do you believe you're going to be appropriately rewarded for your contribution? Do you believe you are praised enough? And things of that nature.
Yeah,
And those roll into the NPS somehow. I never sort of understood, but today you're helping me crystallize why they'd be asking that question in the first place. Because again, I think you're saying that like health can drive performance if you do
totally,
it right.
totally,
Yeah.
totally.
So if you have a gap from where the health is today and where you want it to be, and if you want to tell from experience, it's great, and if not, also fine. But how do you then work on closing the gap?
I mean, I think it really depends on what it is that you're trying to close and what
Mm,
the gap is. I think, and we can talk about specifics, but I think the key thing is to always think about it and again, I love going back to sort of a health analogy because there are interventions that you have to affect, but you have to identify the root cause, right? So for example, whenever I think about it from a health perspective, if you have high cholesterol, your doctor doesn't tell you to go home and do cholesterol, right? They're not like, go home, do cholesterol.
Yeah.
They're like, go and exercise, eat less red meat. How much red meat are you eating? What do you normally get? There's a
Mm,
whole set of additional diagnostics. I mean, medicine has really figured this out.
mhm.
And so, given your existing baseline behavior, then we identify the specific set of interventions that are right for you. So this is where I think, whenever organizations say, okay, like you have a culture problem, let's just whitewash, get a juice bar, get a
Yep.
health club. Like it just sounds like such, like checking of boxes of random shit to give to an
Yeah.
organization. And all
Yep.
of a sudden we all have like giant CapExes with like beautiful health clubs and really nice juice bars. And,
Yeah.
and yet people still hate showing up to work.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think there's a little bit of, okay, but like, what is the baseline of your existing organization? What is it that you're trying to achieve? What are the set of norms so that we can actually see what we need to change and what we don't need to change?
Mm,
Because I think if you apply this sort of internal medicine interventionalist approach, it becomes much more about solving the root cause of your particular ailment rather than kind of whitewashing it with a bunch of virtue signaling to
mhm.
give, here is your DNI, metric, here's the
Right.
health club metric, and here is your insurance, redemption rate, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, Matt, but this is a
Yeah.
very
No.
sort of different way to think about
No,
health.
it totally does. For us who, I mean, I don't think a lot of people who are listening maybe don't have the same level of experience, but when you're trying to be thoughtful, let's say you understand your baseline and you've done the work and you've looked at behavior, people are working late, whatever the thing is. How can you be what tools are there or methods are there to be thoughtful about your interventions? I'm a $50 million company, consumer packaged goods, omni-channel, and things are going well. We've plateaued, and I don't know, expand internationally or continue or reignite growth. Who knows what the health issues are? Could be any number of them. How is that person, once they have a baseline, be thoughtful about the interventions they apply? Do they need a consultant? Is there other ways to come at that? Do you know?
It's interesting. I don't know that you need a consultant, but you need someone who is outsider enough to see things that you might not see,
Okay.
right? Because I think that there is a little bit of how do you have impartiality to the
Hmm.
things that you might feel like, oh, well, we can't do that because we've already tried X, Y, and Z. I think when you become really part of the Kool-Aid, it's difficult to write and identify the nuances of why certain things may or may not have worked in the past. So I think you need a little bit of an outside perspective. I think that's
Hmm.
number one. And I do think number two, and again, I hate to keep harping on this, my sort of love-hate relationship with the word culture. I actually feel like you need to call it something else because I think the moment that you name it culture or I don't know, whatever other term that is, synonymous, there's an inevitable eye roll because every employee has already participated in, at least two, if not more, experiences where something like that has gone not as optimally as it could have.
Yeah, yeah, makes
Right.
sense. Yeah,
And so
totally.
there's just this innate, like, sort of desire to organ reject whatever it is that you're proposing. And so
Right.
to
Yeah.
me, I think health has to, health has to come with performance because if you
Hmm.
tell me it's going to help me perform better, then I'll do it. If you're just kind of telling me I should take this and eat the fruit and like eat more tofu because I should just, eat more spinach just like I should,
Sure.
I might do it, but I probably won't do it with the regularity that you actually need me to.
Got it.
And so I think this is why if you couple performance and health together as an enabler to performance and driving their own either top line growth, value proposition, exit potential, some kind of business imperative, the
Hmm.
likelihood of that success is much greater.
And then, of course, as you said, if you have a clear path for appropriate compensation for performance.